My mother slept with my exes, invited one to Thanksgiving, flirted with my boyfriend on Christmas, and spent my entire life competing with me. I'm writing this at 2:47 a.m. with my phone dimmed all the way down because I still flinch when I hear footsteps outside my bedroom door, even though I moved out months ago. I'm 23, my name is Alice, and on paper, my life looks painfully normal. I finished college last year. I work an entry-level job I don't hate. I date. I laugh with friends. I post dumb selfies like nothing is wrong. That's the version of me people know. What they don't know is that my relationship with my mother has rewired how I see love, trust, and my own worth, and I'm only now realizing how deep the damage goes. My mom, Elizabeth, had me young. She was 17 when I was born and 40 now, and she never lets anyone forget how much she gave up to raise me. Growing up, it was always just the two of us, a unit, a team, or at least that's how she framed it. She didn't like boundaries. She called them walls. She read my diaries because she said secrets rot families from the inside. She commented on my body like it was a shared project, something we both owned. When I started dating in my late teens, she treated my relationships like open discussions, not private experiences. At the time, I thought this was closeness. I thought this was what a strong mother-daughter bond looked like. I didn't know there was supposed to be a line you don't cross. I didn't even know that mothers aren't supposed to feel threatened by their daughters. Looking back, there were signs everywhere, but when you're raised inside something, it feels like air. You don't question it until you start suffocating. I didn't start asking questions until the first boyfriend disappeared from my life in a way that never quite made sense. And even then, I convinced myself I was being dramatic. I'm posting this because the truth finally landed all at once, and I feel like if I don't get it out of my head, it's going to eat me alive. You need to understand Elizabeth to understand why it took me so long to see what was happening. My mom is the kind of woman strangers describe as magnetic, like she's a weather system that pulls the room toward her. She's pretty in a way that feels intentional, not effortless. Sharp eyeliner, perfect hair, perfume that lingers like a signature. She laughs too loud, touches people while she talks, holds eye contact a second longer than is comfortable. When I was a kid, I thought having a cool mom was a flex. My friends adored her. Their moms looked tired and normal. Mine looked like she could walk into any place and be treated like the main character. And she loved it. She fed on attention the way other people breathe. At home, she could be warm and funny, the kind of parent who danced with me in the kitchen and called me my girl, like we were allies against the world. But warmth with her always came with a hook in it. If I pulled away, even a little, she'd get this quiet, wounded look and say things like, "After everything I've done, you're really going to shut me out?" I learned early that her feelings were a responsibility. I learned that saying no meant being punished with icy silence or sudden tears. She was never physically violent, but she could turn a sentence into a blade. She'd compliment me and cut me in the same breath. "That dress looks amazing on you. I wish I had your youth back." Or, "He's cute, honey. Are you sure he's not too cute?" The first time I brought a boy home, she didn't ask me if he treated me well. She asked what he thought of her cooking, her hair, her still being able to pull off tight jeans at 40. She made everything a performance, and I was always cast as the supporting role. She told me I was her best friend, her whole heart, her reason for living, and I wore those words like a crown until I realized they were also a leash. The weirdest part is how she rewrites reality in real time. If you call her out, she doesn't deny it like a normal person. She turns it into a story where you're the villain for even noticing. She says you're sensitive, ungrateful, jealous. She says you're imagining things. She says you're trying to control her because you can't handle that she has a life. For years, that worked on me. I thought I was the problem. I thought I was a bad daughter. I didn't realize my mother wasn't just crossing boundaries. She was erasing them, one smile at a time. My first real boyfriend was a guy named Noah, and when I think about him now, it feels like remembering a life I almost had. We met when I was 18, both awkward and hopeful, both convinced that first love was supposed to feel like jumping off a cliff and trusting the fall. He was gentle, a little shy, the kind of person who asked before touching my hand. When I brought him home for dinner, my mom lit up in a way that made my stomach tighten, though I didn't know why yet. She asked him questions meant for me, laughed at jokes that weren't funny, poured his wine glass before he could even ask. I told myself she was just being welcoming. Over the next few months, she found excuses to insert herself into our relationship. She texted him directly about recipes, about movies, about how worried she was about me when we argued. When I said it made me uncomfortable, she rolled her eyes and said I was being childish. The breakup came suddenly. Noah started pulling away, canceling plans, acting like I'd done something wrong but refusing to say what. One night, after I confronted him, he broke down and said he felt caught in the middle and that things were too complicated. He wouldn't explain, just kept apologizing. After he left, my mom hugged me and whispered that some boys just can't handle strong women, that it wasn't my fault. I cried into her shoulder and let her stroke my hair, never noticing how calm she was, how unsurprised. Months later, I found a text on her old iPad by accident while looking for a recipe. It was from Noah. It said, "I still think about that night. I shouldn't have let it happen." My heart dropped so hard, I thought I might throw up. There was nothing explicit, nothing I could screenshot and point to, just enough to make my skin crawl. When I confronted her, shaking, she laughed. She actually laughed and said I was sick for even thinking something like that about her. She said Noah was confused, that he'd been emotionally unstable, that I was projecting my insecurity onto her. She cried then, said I'd broken her heart by accusing her. I apologized. I still hate myself for that. I convinced myself I'd misread it, that I was paranoid. It was easier than accepting the alternative. That was the first lie I told myself to survive, and it set the pattern for everything that followed. After Noah, I told myself I'd learned my lesson. I stopped bringing boyfriends home. I kept my dating life vague, protected, like something fragile that could shatter if exposed. That worked for a while, until I met Liam. He was older, confident in a quiet way, and he made me feel chosen. When I finally mentioned him to my mom, I framed it carefully, like bad news. She pretended not to care at first, which almost scared me more than her usual enthusiasm. Then she asked what he did for work, then what he looked like. Then she asked to see a photo, just to picture who you're talking about. The shift was subtle but immediate. Suddenly she wanted to know when he'd be around. She made comments about how men like him need a woman who really understands them. She told me I was lucky, but also warned me not to get complacent. The night she met him was a disaster disguised as a success. She wore a dress I'd never seen before, tight and low cut, and she kept touching his arm while she talked. Liam didn't encourage it, but he didn't shut it down either, and I didn't know how to say anything without sounding crazy. After that, he changed. He became distant in a way that felt familiar, like déjà vu I couldn't escape. When we broke up, he told me I deserved better, that he didn't want to hurt me. A year later, I ran into him at a coffee shop, and he looked like he'd seen a ghost. He asked if my mom was still like that. When I pressed him, he went pale and said Elizabeth had reached out to him after the breakup, said she was worried about me, said he should talk to her if he ever needed advice. He said one thing led to another, and he hated himself for it. I went home and threw up. This time, I didn't confront her. I started keeping notes instead, mental ones at first, then literal ones in my phone. Patterns emerged that made my chest feel tight. The timing, the excuses, the way she framed herself as the victim in every version of the story. I wasn't crazy. I was just outmatched by someone who had been manipulating reality longer than I'd been alive. And the worst part was realizing that some part of her enjoyed watching me doubt myself. By the time I met Ethan, I was already half feral with suspicion, but I wanted so badly to believe I could outgrow my past instead of carrying it like a curse. Ethan was kind in an uncomplicated way, the type who listened more than he spoke, who didn't play games. I didn't tell my mom about him for months. I felt like I was hiding contraband. When she eventually found out, not because I told her, but because she accidentally saw his name light up my phone, she smiled in that knowing way that makes your stomach drop before your brain catches up. She said she was happy for me, that she was proud of how independent I'd become. For a while, she behaved. No comments, no prying questions, no sudden need to be involved. It almost felt like a truce. Then Thanksgiving came. I came home early to help cook, and she was already in full host mode. Music playing, wine poured, glowing with that familiar manic energy. When the doorbell rang, she said, "Oh, that must be the last guest," and smiled at me like she was about to reveal a magic trick. I opened the door and froze. Standing there, holding a bottle of wine, was Marcus, my ex from 2 years earlier, someone I'd cut out of my life completely after discovering he'd lied to me about staying in touch with my mother. He looked just as shocked as I felt. My mom breezed past me, kissed him on the cheek, and said, "I thought it would be nice to have everyone together." Everyone. Like he was family, like my discomfort was a detail she hadn't considered or didn't care to. At dinner, she kept steering the conversation towards shared memories, inside jokes I wasn't part of, moments I didn't recognize. Ethan noticed. I could tell by the way his jaw tightened, the way he kept glancing at me like he was trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. I felt small, humiliated, and trapped in my own childhood home. When I confronted her in the kitchen later, she shrugged and said I didn't own people, that Marcus was an adult who could choose his own relationships. She said I was being dramatic on a holiday meant for gratitude. That night, lying in my old bed, I realized something that terrified me more than the betrayals themselves. My mother didn't see what she was doing as wrong. She saw it as winning. After Thanksgiving, something inside me shifted from denial to dread, like my body finally accepted a truth my brain had been dodging for years. Ethan asked questions on the drive back, gentle ones at first, then sharper when my answers didn't line up. I told him a version of the truth that was still padded, still apologetic, like I was responsible for my mother's behavior. He listened, quiet in that way that feels heavier than yelling. A week later, he admitted my mom had messaged him on Instagram months earlier, framed as concern, curiosity, harmless interest. She'd said she wanted to understand the man in her daughter's life. She'd said she felt left out. She'd said I was sensitive about sharing. Ethan swore nothing happened, that he shut it down, but the damage was already done. I could hear her voice in the gaps between his sentences, feel her fingerprints on the narrative. When I confronted Elizabeth, she didn't even bother denying it. She said I was lucky she cared enough to make sure I wasn't dating another disappointment. She said men respect women who take initiative. She said I should be thanking her for looking out for me. Then she pivoted, like she always does, and accused me of trying to control her, of resenting her because she still had options. That's when it clicked, the thing I'd been circling but never named. My mother wasn't just lonely, she was terrified. Terrified of aging, of becoming invisible, of watching her daughter step into a life where she was no longer the center. Every boyfriend of mine was proof that time was moving forward without her permission. So she inserted herself, rewrote the script, made herself desirable again by taking what was mine. Not because she loved them, but because she needed to feel chosen over me. Realizing that didn't make it hurt less. It made it feel intentional, calculated. Like I wasn't collateral damage, but the target. That night, I locked my bedroom door for the first time in my life and sat on the floor shaking, wondering how you grieve someone who's still alive and smiling in the next room. December arrived with a brittle kind of calm, the kind that settles in right before something breaks. I went low contact with my mom, answering texts hours later, skipping casual visits, telling myself space was a solution instead of a delay. Ethan tried to be supportive, but I could feel the strain in ways he didn't have to name. Trust, once cracked, makes a sound even when no one touches it. Then Christmas came. I debated not going home at all, but guilt is a language my mother taught me fluently, and I showed up with wrapped gifts and a knot in my stomach. She greeted Ethan like an old friend, air-kissing his cheek, telling him how good he looked, how she always knew I had taste. Throughout the day, she found reasons to be near him, laughing at his jokes, asking about his childhood, touching his arm when she spoke. It was subtle enough to deny, obvious enough to humiliate. At one point, I walked into the kitchen and caught her adjusting his collar, her fingers lingering. He pulled away, uncomfortable, but she just smiled at me like I was interrupting something innocent. When I finally snapped and asked her to stop flirting with my boyfriend, she looked genuinely amused. She said I was projecting my insecurities again. She said if I trusted Ethan, it wouldn't bother me. She said I needed therapy. The room felt too small, the lights too bright. Later that night, she cornered me alone and said something I can't forget. She said, "You should be careful, Alice. Men don't stay with girls who can't compete." I realized then that this was no longer about blurred boundaries or unresolved trauma. This was war, and she had been training for it her entire life. I left early, crying in the car, while Ethan drove in silence. I didn't know if our relationship would survive her, but I knew I couldn't survive staying silent anymore. The fallout from Christmas didn't explode right away. It seeped in slowly, like water through cracked walls. Ethan tried to reassure me, but reassurance only goes so far when the threat lives inside your family. I started replaying every interaction in my head, every smile my mom gave him, every time she looked at me like I was already losing. A few days after Christmas, Ethan told me Elizabeth had sent him another message. This one wasn't friendly or maternal. It was careful, flattering, written in a tone that suggested intimacy without ever stating it outright. She told him he deserved a woman who trusted herself, who didn't see other women as competition. She said she worried I was too damaged by my past to be a healthy partner. Reading it felt like having my skin peeled back. I confronted her over the phone, and she sighed like I was boring her. She said she was just being honest. She said if I didn't want her involved in my life, maybe I should stop bringing my problems to her. I reminded her I hadn't brought Ethan to her, that she'd inserted herself. She went quiet, then cold, and said something that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. She said, "I gave birth to you. Everything you have came through me first." That was the moment I understood how she saw me. Not as a daughter, not even as a rival, but as an extension, something she could reach through to touch the world, a younger version of herself she could overwrite when it suited her. That night, Ethan and I fought for the first time, not because he'd done anything wrong, but because my mother had planted herself between us like a wedge. I accused him of not setting firm enough boundaries. He accused me of letting her control my life. We both cried. And in the silence that followed, I felt the weight of her victory pressing down on my chest. I started digging because I needed proof that I wasn't imagining the scale of it, that this wasn't just a series of coincidences stitched together by trauma. Late one night, fueled by equal parts dread and adrenaline, I went through old messages, archived emails, social media notifications I'd ignored for years. What I found made my hands go numb. There were threads between Elizabeth and men I used to love, stretching back farther than I wanted to admit. Casual check-ins that turned intimate over time, compliments that escalated into late-night conversations, concern that morphed into something darker. She never crossed lines abruptly. She eased over them like she'd been practicing her whole life. I reached out to Daniel, an ex I hadn't spoken to since I was 19, expecting denial or defensiveness. Instead, he apologized immediately. He said my mom made him feel seen at a time when he felt small. He said she framed it as mutual weakness, as something harmless that happened because they both cared about me. He said he knew it was wrong, but didn't know how to stop once it started. Hearing that shattered something in me. She hadn't just taken advantage of power dynamics with me, she'd weaponized vulnerability in everyone around her. The realization that this wasn't about attraction but control made my skin crawl. When I confronted her with specifics, names, dates, screenshots, she didn't panic. She smiled, slow and pitying, and said I'd always been dramatic. She said these men came to her because I pushed them away. She said I should ask myself why no one ever stayed. I felt like a child again, small and shaky, desperate for approval even as I was being gutted. That's when I understood the deepest twist of all. She didn't need to win against me publicly. She needed me to doubt myself privately. And she had built her entire identity around making sure I did. The breaking point didn't come with a scream or a dramatic exit. It came quietly, on a Tuesday afternoon, when my mom showed up at my apartment unannounced. She stood in my doorway like she owned the space, looked around and said it was cute, in a tone that meant temporary. She told me Ethan had blocked her, said it like an accusation, like I'd orchestrated it. When I didn't apologize, her face changed. The charm dropped. She said I was ungrateful, that I'd turned everyone against her, that I was trying to erase her because I couldn't stand the idea of her still being desired. I laughed then, a sharp, ugly sound that didn't feel like it came from me. I told her she'd slept with my boyfriends. Not hinted, not implied, said it out loud. The word slept hung in the air like smoke. She didn't deny it. She shrugged and said, relationships are complicated, that life isn't as black and white as I want it to be. She said I should stop acting like a victim when I benefited from her raising me alone. I told her being alone didn't give her the right to consume me. That's when she slapped me. Not hard enough to bruise, just enough to remind me she still thought she could. She immediately burst into tears, said she didn't know what came over her, said I was pushing her too far. Watching her cry after hurting me snapped something clean in my chest. I asked her to leave. She refused. I threatened to call the police. She laughed and said I wouldn't. I did. When the officers arrived, she played confused, wounded, heartbroken. They asked if I wanted to press charges. I said no. But when she finally left, screaming that I was dead to her, I sat on the floor and realized something terrifying and freeing. For the first time in my life, I had chosen myself over her, and the world hadn't ended. Going no contact felt less like freedom and more like withdrawal. My phone stayed silent in a way that made my chest ache, even though the silence was what I'd begged for. I kept expecting her to show up, to find a new way in, because she always did. For weeks, I jumped at every knock, every unknown number. Ethan tried to be patient, but the strain finally snapped one night when he admitted he was exhausted from fighting a ghost. He said he loved me, but he didn't know how to build a future with someone whose past kept reaching into the room and rearranging the furniture. I couldn't argue with him. When we broke up, it was quiet and mutual and devastating in its maturity. I cried harder over that than I had over any of the others, because this time I knew exactly who to blame. And it wasn't myself. A month later, my mom sent a letter, not a text. A handwritten letter in familiar looping script. She said she'd been thinking, that therapy had helped her see things clearly. She apologized without apologizing, using words like misunderstandings and mutual hurt. She said she missed me, that she felt like she was dying without her daughter. She said she wanted to meet, just to talk, just to heal. I read it over and over, my hands shaking, part of me desperate to believe her. I almost went. What stopped me was a detail I can't explain without sounding paranoid. At the bottom of the page, she'd drawn a small heart, the same way she always did when she was trying to remind me of who she used to be to me. I realized then that she wasn't reaching out because she'd changed. She was reaching out because she'd lost control. And the hardest truth I've had to swallow is that love, to her, has always been a way to keep me within reach. The universe has a cruel sense of timing because just when I started to feel steady again, the cracks reopened from a direction I didn't expect. A woman named Clara messaged me on a random Tuesday night, her profile blank, her tone careful. She said she thought we might share the same mother. At first I assumed scam or confusion or some elaborate mistake, but when she sent a photo, my blood went cold. She had my mother's eyes, same sharp tilt, same knowing expression. Clara was 26, older than me. She explained slowly, like she was afraid I'd disappear if she moved too fast. Elizabeth had gotten pregnant as a teenager before me and given the baby up. Or at least that's the version she'd told Clara years later when they reconnected. Clara said Elizabeth drifted in and out of her life, always intense, always charming, always just out of reach. She said something had always felt off, especially when Elizabeth asked invasive questions about her dating life, about the men she loved. Clara hesitated before typing the next part. She said Elizabeth had crossed lines with one of her exes too. Not once. More than once. Reading that felt like falling through a trapdoor I didn't know existed. This wasn't just about me. It never had been. We talked for hours, trading stories that mirrored each other so closely it felt rehearsed. The jealousy, the competition, the way Elizabeth framed herself as the only woman who would ever truly understand us. I realized my mother hadn't just repeated a pattern. She'd perfected it. She collected daughters the way other people collect mirrors, using us to reflect herself back when time threatened to dull the image. When I finally put my phone down, the grief hit me in waves. Not just for myself, but for the version of Elizabeth I'd spent my whole life trying to protect. She had built an empire out of insecurity, and we were the bricks. And knowing that made forgiveness feel less like a virtue and more like surrender, Clara and I kept talking after that. Cautiously at first, like two survivors comparing notes in a language only we spoke. The more we shared, the clearer the pattern became, and the sicker it made me feel. Elizabeth didn't just blur boundaries, she rewrote roles. She positioned herself as confidant, competitor, and judge all at once, shifting masks depending on what gave her the most leverage. Clara told me about a night when Elizabeth had cried on her couch, saying she felt replaced by younger women, saying she was scared of becoming nothing. Hours later, she'd turned that vulnerability into flirtation with Clara's boyfriend, framing it as a shared moment of weakness. Hearing that, something inside me finally stopped trying to make excuses. This wasn't about love or loneliness. It was about domination dressed up as intimacy. Clara admitted she'd cut contact years ago after Elizabeth accused her of being jealous and ungrateful. The same script I'd heard my entire life. We laughed at the sameness of it, a dark, hollow sound that felt like mourning. Then the twist landed. Clara told me Elizabeth had reached out to her recently too. Same language, same remorse, same request to meet and heal as a family. The idea that she was trying to pull us both back into her orbit at the same time made my skin crawl. I realized how close I'd come to stepping back into the fire just because she knew which words still worked on me. That night, I blocked her number for good. I changed my email. I told Clara I was done being part of her story. When I hit block, I expected panic or grief or guilt. What I felt instead was grief's quieter cousin, clarity. For the first time, the narrative wasn't being rewritten in front of me. It was mine, unedited. And in that stillness, I understood something brutal and freeing. My mother might never change, but I could. Cutting her off didn't make the nightmares stop. It made them louder at first, like my brain was finally allowed to say everything it had swallowed. I dreamed of doors without locks, of mirrors that showed her face instead of mine. In waking life, the consequences rippled outward in quieter ways. Friends asked why I didn't visit my mom anymore, why holidays were suddenly complicated. I learned how uncomfortable people get when you tell the truth about a mother who isn't safely flawed but actively harmful. Some believed me, some didn't. A few suggested I was exaggerating. That stung more than I expected because it echoed her voice, the one that trained me to doubt my own memory. Elizabeth didn't disappear, though. She tried to re-enter through proxies. An aunt messaged to say my mom was unwell and needed me. An old family friend emailed to remind me how much Elizabeth had sacrificed. Then came the last attempt, the one that chilled me. A mutual acquaintance casually mentioned Elizabeth had been asking about me, specifically whether I was seeing anyone new. It felt like a predator checking a trail. That's when fear finally burned off the remaining guilt. I realized no amount of distance would matter if I kept minimizing what she'd done. So I started telling the truth without softening it. I told my therapist everything. I told Clara everything. I wrote it down, all of it. Not as an accusation, but as a record, because abusers thrive on fog. The more clearly I named it, the less power it had. I stopped imagining a future reconciliation, stopped fantasizing about an apology that would fix the past. Instead, I focused on building something small and solid. Routines, friendships, a sense of self that didn't require permission. It wasn't dramatic, it was slow and unglamorous and real. And somewhere in that process, I stopped waiting for her shadow to move before I stepped forward. I don't know what kind of ending people expect from stories like this. There's no courtroom scene, no public exposure, no moment where Elizabeth finally understands and collapses in remorse. She's still out there, charming and convinced of her own innocence. Sometimes I still hear her voice in my head, telling me I'm cruel, dramatic, ungrateful. The difference now is that I don't automatically believe it. I'm learning what it means to be a person separate from the woman who raised me. And it's harder than it sounds. I grieve the mother I thought I had. I grieve the version of myself who thought love meant proximity at any cost. I'm angry about the relationships I lost, the trust that was poisoned before it had a chance to grow. But I'm also proud, in a quiet way, of the fact that I survived a war no one else could see. Writing this feels like lighting a candle in a room that was dark for a long time. If you're reading this and something in your chest feels tight, if you're wondering whether you're overreacting to a parent who makes you feel small, please hear this. Love doesn't compete with you. Love doesn't need to win. Love doesn't hollow you out and call it closeness. I don't know what my future looks like yet. I'm rebuilding slowly, learning how to choose people who don't feel familiar in the worst way. Maybe one day I'll fall in love again without fear standing between us. Maybe I'll trust myself fully. For now, it's enough to know that the cycle stops here. She doesn't get to write the rest of my story. I do.